I was on a family vacation until Monday. I got back late Monday night, and I had sort of a dream in the back of my head that I would do some sort of academic paper with all kinds of research in it. And I do have research that I may cite during, some of which I may cite while I'm talking, but I'm just going to name drop now that Ed Glazer, who I actually had the pleasure of being with for 2 days about a month ago at Harvard to come up with a way of measuring performance for cities. Good luck with that. He likes cities. He grew up in New York City, and he's an advocate of density and complexity and sees the value in cities, even though he's somewhat of a conservative. And James Taylor from British Columbia, who's done a lot of work now about the positive impacts of complex street networks. Eric Dunbaugh, who has research that just came out that's published in the American Planning magazine about how clear zones create hazards, contrary to the usual feeling that they don't create hazards. Peter Swift, who's done a lot of work, and he's real active in the CNU, as Eric is, on traffic safety and street width. Norm Garrick, who's the head of the traffic engineering program at University of Connecticut and is on the board of CNU, has done research on 24 California cities, cities smaller than San Diego, Sacramento, and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and compared them in terms of the character of their street grid and whether or not there are fatalities and crashes that cause injuries, and came to the conclusion that overwhelmingly that cities with complex street grids save lives. And I'd also, if I was doing an academic research paper, would cite Joel Courtwright, who's done a lot of guesstimates on real estate prices lately and is making the claim that urbanism is doing better in the real estate market. I'm not as confident that that ultimately will be true, but I want to believe it. But I just put that caveat in. And the American Society of Civil Engineers has recently done a study that shows that there's a 10% advantage for street networks with high intersection density, and that Price Waterhouse did their annual rah-rah for urbanism in the emerging trends, which since they started doing it, the emerging trend is always urbanism, which I appreciate. Some years it follows up better on its predictions than others. And then Mark Epley at Marquette, who I think you might know.
He was a PhD student of ours at Wisconsin.
Great. All right. Well, he and some other fellows at Wharton are doing a lot of work showing how very urban places with well served by complex street grids are doing well. So okay, now I want to have fun and talk about what I really came here to talk about, and the value of cities, what's attacked them, and why they're valuable, and how we can restore them and undo a lot of the mistakes that were made over the last 60 years by government intervention. We're used to thinking of sprawl as an expression of the free market, that Milton Friedman somehow, his kind of free market, but I don't even think Milton Friedman, who I have met and had lunch with one day, I don't think he was a big advocate of interference in the marketplace for any mode of transportation in particular. And so you can't blame him one way or the other. But sprawl, I think, is definitely a result of very, very serious intervention in the economy by the government. And the basic two ingredients of sprawl, which are highly separated uses, separate use zoning, and roads that are converted from their traditional, in urban locations, streets have traditionally served three purposes: economic, social, and of course movement of traffic. but have been dumbed down to just be for one purpose, movement of traffic, and the commerce and the social purpose has been lost. And you can see that in this picture of sprawl, where the streets have no sidewalks and all of the retail uses are recessed. Every single use is separated, and this drawing can even make it more clear, where everything is separated out and it forces people to travel long distances. It's not that this should never happen, but it's very irritating to us who believe in urbanism that urbanism is prohibited in most of the United States, not just by zoning codes, but by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which Republicans always talk about how they want to get rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Wouldn't bother me if it was gotten rid of, because it's had a very negative effect on those who want to create mixed-use built environments. So, you know, why hasn't Main Street been built much in America until very recently? One of the reasons is because if you have houses above a store, that project can't have more than 20% non-retail in terms of, I think it's imputed rent, right, Richard? And so that really makes it hard to have an urban place. So there's all kinds of ways that the government intervenes to make it hard to have urban form. And so this kind of scene, which is Wicker Park in Chicago at North Avenue, Damon and Milwaukee Avenue. And these streets are 50 feet wide with parking all day, even at rush hour. There's congestion. The desire of the retail merchants to have their businesses served by street parking, which is the kind of parking that people like right in front of the store. Even though they won't get the spot right in front of the store, they have the illusion that they'll get it. And if with Don Shoup's help, maybe they'll actually get it with the right pricing. But you know, this form, the politics of Chicago ended up with the merchants having more power than the traffic engineering program, and so the functional classification level of service diktat did not apply here. And it's one of the most prosperous neighborhoods in Chicago, Wicker Park. And this is another one like that in Toronto. This is Dundas Street and the Dundas Street streetcar, which runs in the same lane. There's one lane in each direction, parking all day, even at rush hour. It's horribly congested. It's not just congested, though, with traffic. It's congested with money and with people. It's congested with real estate value. There's a different set of circumstances or different goals applied in this kind of setting, where the goal of the community is value added rather than traffic flow. Not that traffic flow is a consideration that shouldn't exist at all, but it shouldn't exist in isolation in an urban setting. It can exist in isolation in a rural setting. As far as I'm concerned, I could care less what they do in a rural setting. I'm an urbanist. I'm for urban. And here's another example in Milwaukee. This is Kinnickinnick Avenue, a street built out in the late 19th century. And here you've got the two-rod street, 2 rods from the center line to the building line with the 8-foot sidewalks. Retail on the first floor with apartments or offices above, and a rich variety of retail. You have a hardware store, liquor store, a gas station down the street, coffee shops, a kinky leather clothing store, more liquor stores, more taverns. All these things, plus after you've gone to some of these places, you can go to a Catholic church, which the front door of is over here, and confess your sins all on the same street. You know, you could go to this street. But in the current environment, because of separate use zoning and because of large blocks and low intersection density and the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and everything, you can't, it's almost impossible to find any place that's been built in the last 30 years or so where a church would be on the same block with another building. I mean, it's gotten to that point. This is the standard street. Now the two-rod street, if you'd gone to civil engineering school in the 1920s, you would have learned the two-rod street as a typical model for a commercial street. Now it's this, 72 feet of pavement, 20-foot median so you can have double pork chop left turn lanes, and then no money left over for a sidewalk so people walk in the dirt. Or as an alternative, you can walk in the gutter. And this is, you know, the American love affair with the automobile. Here it is. It's on display. If you're a pedestrian, you walk in the gutter as sort of a criminal suspect. And then if you want to be a real American, you ride in the car. That's the choice that Americans are given. I'm not saying this kind of road shouldn't be built, but it shouldn't be the only kind of road that's allowed to be built, which is what you get under the current policies. Over about half, a little over half of the road money that's spent in the country goes to these grade-separated expressways. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have those. They have them in Europe, but they usually don't put them in urban context. They reduce. So anyway, an argument I want to make with you today is that sprawl is actually, it's not a conservative idea. American conservatives should open up their eyes and realize that sprawl is a communist-induced condition. Now, Corbusier was not a communist. He was a socialist, but not a communist. But he was very seductive in his ideas. And you can see that if you go to Harvard School of Design, where about 25% of the students have glasses exactly like that. And this was his model. This was his model in 1922. The city of tomorrow with the new technology, and it's brilliant, really. It's an expression of you know, the open road in the city, in the urban context. And so you have grade separation and then this steel and glass buildings. And it's now played out all across the American landscape. This is the Jefferson Davis Highway, honoring the President of the Confederacy. They were in favor of slavery. We honor them with this road. Anyway, but there's no sidewalk. It's illegal to walk on it. It was illegal for me to take this picture. The statute of limitations has run out, so I'm off the hook. And it's now actually, I'm an optimist. It's being fixed, although this photograph is really pixelated, sorry. But this is sort of a Dupont.
Hazy, John.
Yeah. But it's, this is sort of an attempt at, by a new urbanist architect, John Torty, to do Dupont Circle, which is a big traffic machine, heavily engineered, so that engineers can really enjoy doing, but it also is beautiful and very urban, proving that you can actually build something that's not hideous. This is another traffic machine. The biggest multi-way boulevard in America is Central Park. It has about 19 lanes or something like that. And Olmsted actually was quite a fan of grade separation. But he meant it to be a special place of beauty in a man-made creation of nature, not to have it be something that intervened in the city itself. Now, Corbusier's attempt to do this sort of thing in Europe didn't work very well. And so this was the Jewish quarter on the right bank of the Seine. All the streets were meant to be grade separated, so the pedestrians were gotten out of the way of the vehicles. And the Parisians rebelled against it, although they did build some things like that on the edge of the town, the Banlieue, where all the rioting has been lately. Now this is Gropius, Walter Gropius, who actually my family has a little history with him. My wife's great aunt was his personal assistant, and they had quite a, well, I won't get into all that. But he was the other great leader of the modernists, and he was also a social democrat, and the Bauhaus movement, a lot of beautiful artistic creations. And he had to leave Germany, and he almost immediately became head of the Harvard School of Design. And he set out to change the rules. Now, why did he want to change the rules? I speculate that he didn't like the Beaux-Arts and the imperial architecture because how could you like it after World War I? I mean, the most brutal war up to that point, whatever, 20 million killed, the machine gun war, a mechanized killing. And so the empires made a hash of it. So the modernist movement didn't like that architecture. So they started killing. And he really went out of his way at Harvard to take what had been a Beaux-Arts school and turn it into a modernist academy and kill the street and all the other things that Corbusier talked about. They actually said the end of history, just like Francis Fukuyama at the 1927 Siam meeting. Well, one of the things he set out to kill was the terminated vista, which is a many thousands of year old planning architecture creation. This is in Port Washington, a little village with only 9,000 people, and it was built out in the 1880s and 90s. The simple street, two-rod street, 2 rods from the center lane of the building line, retail on the first floor, buildings above, and then the Catholic Church terminating the vista. It comes from a pattern book from Krakow, which was part of the Austrian Empire at the time when this was done. And if you go to Krakow, which I still haven't gotten there, I was in Łódź and Warsaw in December, but I couldn't get to Krakow to get a picture. Anyway, this wasn't done in America after the war for about 40 years, except in 2 places, and this is one of them. The other one is in Anaheim. This is in Orlando. So Disney terminated the vista and created this form. And of course, here's an old hill town in Italy, or the Chicago Board of Trade terminating the vista on LaSalle Street in creating real estate value. LaSalle Street is a wonderful street with good occupancy, at least compared to a lot of other places. And then Amsterdam in the 17th century terminated vista. So why can't that happen today? I mean, why, after it spread through all the architecture and planning schools except Miami and Notre Dame, and it's now infected the American built environment, never to do this, how could it happen again? Can the architecture schools reform it? No. It's developers. They're discovering it, and Target, retailers like Target, they now insist in retail developments that they must have the head of the T intersection because that's how they advertise their name. And it's a little bit crass at this point, but it'll get better. I mean, you know, you have to give it time. But it does work. This is in Gaithersburg. There was an interior-facing mall that was scraped, and no malls are being built anymore, or almost no, about an average of about 1 a year. But the big boxes that migrated out, they're now willing to come back into collective existence with the other stores. In this case, I don't have the picture, but around the corner there's a Kohl's that also terminates the vista. The H is almost in line with the center lane. Now this guy is a communist. This is Oscar Niemeyer, and he designed Brasilia, and he loves grade separated highways. And separate use zoning and all that stuff. He did some work in Havana, but his biggest work is in Brasilia with the towers. And here's a grade separation. And it's the most lifeless city on earth, except maybe that one in India that Corbusier did. Until you get to the edge where the shanty towns are and the free market takes over, and all of a sudden you get great restaurants and nightclubs and all that stuff once you get outside of his plan. So anyway, I just want you to know that sprawl is a communist plot. Now, somebody want to guess what city this is?
Los Angeles.
No, but it does look like Broadway or Spring Street. Yeah. But this is Detroit in the spring of 1946. And you can see the streetcars and the sidewalks are packed. And then they started changing it. The streetcars, which were paying taxes, went out of business in 1956. The last line was removed. And they started, the government came in and started taking property and creating roads where the people could drive fast, at least during non-peak hours. And they had 3 department stores in downtown Detroit, including this one, which was the second biggest in the U.S. at the time, Hudson's, which was then torn down 35 years after the war. So this is Berlin. In May 1945, right at the end of the war, about 70% of the buildings are either destroyed or so damaged they had to be razed in the center districts within the city proper itself. And then, of course, now they have this ULI winning project, Potsdamer Platz, which has the biggest train station in Europe now underneath the street there. But this was where the wall went through, so it was a complete ghost land. There was nothing. And now it's all built back. This is Poland, Warsaw at the end of the war. Most of the city was destroyed. There are some buildings like the Bristol Hotel didn't get destroyed because that's where the German general staff was bivouacked. But now it's all back. This is one of the few good things the communists did in Poland at the end of the war. By 1951, this was all rebuilt. This is the Old Town Square, built right back, almost to the same specifications, although slightly bigger, as it turns out. And this is Detroit about 5 years ago. And about 30% of the land that had buildings on it at the end of the war now doesn't. And the population of the city is less than half. The city has no retail space of more than 100,000 square feet. It's a city of 800,000 people without any big grocery stores, no retail to speak of, and it is a basket case.
Didn't the last McDonald's pull out recently?
I can't believe that would happen. McDonald's is even in East St. Louis, but maybe, you could be right. But anyway, so it's not the only reason, but if you start throwing out other reasons like, oh, well, it's a car city and it lost the car industry. So did Torino, Italy. Torino, Italy doesn't look like this. Any number of cities around the world that have survived deindustrialization. But it is, in some ways, the most successful city. This is how it looks at ground level. Those are Pheasant. It is the most successful city in terms of the goal, which was to reduce traffic congestion. And Detroit no longer has a problem with traffic congestion. They have solved it. They don't have money congestion. They don't have people congestion. They don't have any kind of congestion. And it happened in other places as well. Like this is Hartford, where Highway, I think it's 84, goes right through the middle of town, and about 30% of the downtown is now surface parking lots. And in Milwaukee, this was the Black Street, Walnut Street, after hours, the people like Duke Ellington would play downtown, and then at 2 in the morning go out here and.
Well, that's what B.B. King recorded.
Probably. Yeah. Anyway, so this is the way it looks now. They just took it out, and there's side effects for the neighborhood. You get all the dirt, the smell, and the noise, so they put up the sound barriers, which is the only surviving technology of the old East German Republic. And if Erich Honecker came back to life, he would be totally disoriented if he went to San Antonio. He'd be totally disoriented in Berlin, but if he went to San Antonio. This is actually the Martin Luther King Drive. This is what was built to honor Dr. King in San Antonio. And the car industry, it's hard to sell cars with those kinds of scenes, so they'll either go rural or urban. This is the Charles Bridge in Prague, and it doesn't meet AASHTO FHWA standards. In fact, none of the bridges in Prague meet FHWA standards. The capacity's all too small. And just imagine what the US DOT could do to Prague if we unleashed the program on them. And we tried to do, this is one road that wasn't built, the Williamsburg Bridge to the Holland Tunnel, which Jane Jacobs and others, even Carmen DeSapio fought that road. It was amazing. This is the West Side Highway, built in the 1920s and 30s in two different segments. And it fell down in 1973 and then fell down again in 1975. And they had a big fight over about what to do with it. It was hard getting enough money to build the Westway, and there was opposition, so they didn't, and all they did was build a street. So West Street is now there. It opened up the river to the neighborhoods, Chelsea and Tribeca and so forth. And there was a real estate boom that came with that. And also in San Francisco, the Embarcadero, which was built starting in 1950 over the opposition of the local state representative, who was Caspar Weinberger, who at that time was a moderate to liberal Republican, and the demographics of San Francisco, the political demographics, were a little different in 1950 than they are today. But anyway, I ran into Caspar Weinberger in 1990, right after they made the decision not to rebuild the Embarcadero. We were at a school choice voucher conference, which CNU supports school choice vouchers because they're good for cities. That's a really big conservative issue. Anyway, Caspar Weinberger was laughing about the people in San Francisco. He said, those hippies would die if they knew I was the original opponent of the Embarcadero Freeway. But anyway, that's the way it looked from Market Street, and that's the way it looks now, pretty much like it did before the freeway was built. Maybe a little fancier, the lighting. They wasted money on making those light poles too fancy probably, but it is San Francisco. And then in Milwaukee, without an earthquake, this road had been built through the north side of downtown. All the land uses were surface parking. You could park your car all day on the river and have it look out over the river. And so anyway, without an earthquake, we took it out. That's the plan. Most of it is carried out. The part that's actually in the corridor is owned by the county government, and they put all kinds of restrictions on it, like you have to pay living wages. If in any tenant that rents space in any building built in the corridor has to pay living wages. So there's the land that the county owned is still unoccupied and will be until the county government dies, which it should die, hopefully someday, of its own weight. See, I forgot to tell you, I'm a Democrat, but I was elected 4 times mayor of Milwaukee without AFSCME's endorsement, just to give you an idea. I was respectful of the unions, but I just didn't do everything they wanted. Now, the most dramatic example of transformation, this highway, which was built right through the middle of Seoul over the river that runs right through the downtown, this was built right after the Korean War, and it had about 80,000 cars a day. And in 2001, a new mayor was elected who didn't like it. He had always been angry about the fact the river had been covered up. And so they took it out. They replaced it with 2 moving lanes on each side. They didn't try to replace the capacity. There's a rich street grid in Seoul, and so they just let the traffic blend in. Now there's a new subway line plus a new BRT line. And so, you know, there were other things that helped mitigate it. But when you have a really rich street grid that has lots of choices for travel consumers, you don't have to worry so much about eliminating something that's a really big structure.
Well, John, we won't believe you until you say the name of it. What's the name of that river?
It's the...
Quine.
Yeah.
Help him out. He doesn't know what the name of the river is.
It's stream.
What's it? Say the name of it.
Chongdae stream.
That's the name, yeah. You're right. I was just checking to see.
I've read about it many times, you can never pronounce it.
See, there's the mayor.
Oh, yeah.
See it? And now he's the president. See how happy he is? If you do something like that, it makes you happy.
I've been going to the river about 18 years now, and yeah, traffic in Seoul is much better than it used to be.
Yeah, you don't need
It's
to
not
concentrate it in
but-
these giant structures, which may be appropriate out in the countryside, but not in the city. Now, everybody's condemning the big boxes, not the CNU. We don't condemn the big boxes because we think they're department stores. And if you really want retail, I could never quite understand this. We like department stores, we don't like big boxes. But the big boxes are selling a variety of goods, you know, not Home Depot, but like Target, Kohl's. They're department stores by any other name. And if you structure them right, you can actually, and this is Home Depot in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, which is about the equivalent of San Francisco's, you know, it's a very wealthy neighborhood. But anyway, this is a Home Depot on a street with escalators. If you took the name Home Depot off and put Nordstrom's on, it would work just fine. The parking's hidden in the back, but one of the things that people do in cities is you can actually go there, buy stuff, and then have it delivered to your house. You don't have to necessarily have an SUV, although there's plenty of SUVs that go there. I just want people to understand that it's not just about roads, it's about all kinds of specialties assaulting the complexity of the city. And one of those, which you heard about last year if you were here from Don Shoup, is parking regulations. This lot, this was an empty lot for 30 years. It's 19-foot frontage, and there was a requirement that you had to have 7 off-street parking spots on the lot. So nothing was built. Why would you build anything? It's crazy. So we removed the regulation, and then this was built. And so a hole in the street was filled in. Another thing which Don talked about a little bit in his book was the bowling alley regulations. Somebody in Ohio, some planner, Chillicothe or Lima, someplace, an alderman said, hey, how many parking spots should we require for the bowling alley? And the city planner says 5. 5 per lane. 5 per lane. So, you know, there's only 4 people bowling. So it's 5 per lane. So that zoning code, that's spread through the whole Midwest, from Ohio to Iowa and everywhere. And all over the Midwest, you can now see these empty parking lots with, you know, the empty bowling alley. You know, and maybe it'll get converted to something else someday, hopefully. But, you know, the intervention of specialties, the unnecessary damaging of the urban fabric for these things. Another one was setbacks because the 2-rod street wasn't big enough, so they had to get to the 72-foot arterial. And in Milwaukee on National Avenue, which is a big east-west street, they had this setback that made all the buildings for 3 miles non-conforming uses. Well, imagine, you can't clear your building through the title search. I mean, you can't borrow money to fix it. I mean, it's ridiculous. It was property tax-based suicide. That's what we were doing. And so we got rid of that stuff and then let somebody of right just pull a permit. And that's one of the best ways to heal a city, is to have a fast permitting process with a good urban code. And you can see things happen very quickly. And here, right in, I wanted to point out, right here in Pasadena, you've got Del Mar Station, which has all these houses, all the condos and everything packed around the train station, giving people the opportunity to use the train conveniently, instead of having a parking lot and then having the apartments off somewhere else. Put them there. It's not that a lot of probably the majority of them own a car and drive, but they just don't have to. You know, they have the option of doing something else. And this can be healed. This is Cisco's parking lot, and this actually didn't happen, but I think it's such a cool slide that maybe it will happen someday. But we always worry about suburbia. You know, instead of attacking it, let's fix it. You know, we don't have to tell people they're not good because they live in the suburbs. You know, I mean, I used to do that when I was mayor because they didn't have any vote in the city, so screw them. I had Waukesha County, they were saying, well, we want that Milwaukee water for Lake Michigan, and if you don't give it to us, what are we going to do? I said, you're going to dry up and blow away. That's what you're going to do. But anyway, now I have a broader perspective. And then I wanted to cast the analogy that the engineering and the criteria and the goals can change. With wetlands, we've learned, even the Army Corps of Engineers has learned that the wetland has value, that it absorbs congestion, water congestion. It is a setting for interesting plants and animals and valuable things. And so we don't automatically drain them and try to speed up the water. Sometimes that still happens, and sometimes maybe even it should happen. But we've learned to value wetlands. But our level of service functional classification system is all about making the pipe bigger, and the government only wants to pay for this, the state DOTs and the feds, the collector roads, service roads, and then this is the stuff they don't pay for. But that's where all the value is, the economic value, the cultural value, and this is wrong. It's not that this shouldn't ever happen, but a lot of times the street grid is actually more important. Why is a trip 40 miles on a freeway valuable to the government, but if somebody walks across the street to work, that's not? Why shouldn't they at least be equal? Shouldn't walking to work be something that's just as important? But the government, I understand why. You have the United States Senate dominated by these unpopulated states with vast distances to travel. There's all kinds of reasons why, but it's really dumb because it doesn't add value to the economy. You look at the tremendous real estate success of Washington, D.C., especially now that they don't have a mayor who's on crack cocaine. It's amazing how the real estate bounces back. But it's this rich street grid, which is now aided by the metro that goes under it as well. But all the choices that consumers have, and there are some big facilities like Connecticut Avenue, which carries a lot of traffic at rush hour, and it carries it better than the freeway, like the Whitehurst, which congests and slows down much more than Connecticut does at rush hour. So there are ways to deal with these things that add more value. The whole idea of the defense highways, one of the things about it was that it was supposed to save us if the Soviets launched. You have 27 minutes or whatever it is to get out of Houston. Well, we saw when Hurricane Rita came, it ended up there were vehicle fires and 52 people died and all. Everybody tried to use these few roads, whereas if you have a street grid and you have many routes, then the congestion doesn't stop you and you might get out of town before the launch. Now, so we're working on all these things. We're trying to make it better. The ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, we're working with them, and this is a draft, the cover of the draft, but now we have this thing coming out in Savannah, trying to legitimize again the avenue, the street, the boulevard as federal eligible highway, for federal road money and state money. We're working with LEED ND. LEED ND is what we're at. The green building people, by the way, they just had this study came out that showed the green buildings really didn't perform that well, a lot of them, the ones that got the awards. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them, this is HSBC Bank. They moved their headquarters from a Metro suburban train stop in the close-in suburbs of Chicago, way out. The closest train station was in like 7 miles away, and they got a gold award from, God, I forgot to turn the phone off. So anyway, they got this gold award. So we complained. We said to the green building people, "Oh, you're so green, but all the people they all have to drive to work now. What's wrong with you?" So they said, "Okay, we'll do LEED ND." So we've got all these regulations and everything that are probably going to, So they're probably going to cause Peter to have nightmares if he ever reads them. But you should know, Peter, it was the CNU, the 5 out of 15 from CNU. We were the conservatives. We were the ones holding back the Sovietization of the entire economy. It was the smart growth people. You have to watch those people, although we're sort of part of the movement. But what I want you to see here is that, we look at pollution, we think, oh, well, out in the countryside, it's nice. Yeah, that's nice. It's those dirty people in the city, all of the schmutzige Luft in the city. But if you look at who creates the energy consumption per capita is much higher out there. This is Chicago, and it's in the areas where the density is greater and the connectivity is greater, that the energy use is much lower. Now, that's a good thing. It's good for the environment. I'm not an urbanist because of the environment. I was very tempted when the global warming thing heated up, to use a phrase. I was very tempted to say, good, wow, catastrophe. Now we can impose our ideas by right. We'll just go out there and make everybody do everything we want. We have a default mechanism, global warming, which will enforce it. But that's not why I'm for urbanism. There's so many benefits to good urbanism. Even in areas that aren't that dense, you can have good urbanism. We work all the way from the rural hamlet to the big city. And if you organize a rural hamlet right, instead of putting everything separated and separate use and everything, you can have a village in a relatively low density area, and people have a lot of, they can live the low density life. It can be good, but apply some good urbanism to it. And we've had this sort of culture war thing where, are you for the suburbs, are you for the city? The debate between Richard Florida and Joel Kotkin. Who won that debate so far is Florida, because his speaking fees are slightly higher. That's who's winning the debate, but not by much. But anyway, the urbanism it has lots of benefits, and I didn't go into all of that and can't possibly do it, but in terms of traffic safety, pedestrian safety, in terms of people having an opportunity to walk, in terms of, we've been working on school siting. The National Association of School Facilities Planners has these ridiculous standards, like minimum 30 acres for high schools and 1 additional acre for each 100 students. Those are things that work against the quality of life of Americans. And by changing that, by getting these barriers out of the way, in LEED ND, one of the things we put in there was a new school standard to compete with the one the facility planners have. It's a maximum of 12 acres for a high school, 8 acres for a middle school, and 5 acres for a grade school. That's better. You can then fit it into the neighborhood. And so on every level, we're trying to work on these things to try to show the benefits of urbanism and to eliminate the public policies that block urbanism from forming. You'll notice I haven't mentioned things like growth boundaries. Sure, secretly, we'd love to do like Hamburg, Germany, where they have these little fingers and completely rural or wilderness, and the neighborhood goes out and there's this line between the two. Sure, I admit it. If I could get away with that, I'd probably want to do it. But it's not going to happen in most of America, and it doesn't even happen in Portland, where the line is really fuzzy, and it's really not the major reason that Portland is the way it is. But urbanism is a good thing. It's good for the environment. It's the most, I would say this to Al Gore, who never talks about urbanism anymore because his political consultants were afraid to have him do it during the 2000 campaign. God damn it. I thought I had turned that off. So anyway, Al Gore won't talk about it. The most convenient remedy to what he's trying to accomplish would be the human settlement patterns. That's the single biggest difference between Europe and the United States in terms of energy consumption is settlement pattern. And so urbanism, new urbanism, is the convenient remedy to the inconvenient truth. Thank you.
it turns out we agree on a lot of stuff, so it takes away from
Yeah, I was actually
fun.
expecting some stuff that
Yeah, but I will try. I didn't have your paper, so I had to channel what you were going to say. So everything I say now is based on my channeling, not the real John. Okay? But if we work hard, we can find areas for disagreement. Okay? Now, this is the cartoon that I use in all my classes, and I use it because it poses a research question. And the research question is a profound one, and the profound one is, how do we get so rich? And that's the big question in front of all of us. How do we get so rich since these guys? Anyway, so when people address the how do we get so rich question, there are a bunch of things they come up with. Some people say institutions matter. We've heard that this morning. Other people talk about human capital and the spread of ideas. Other people talk about cities are the engines of economic growth. Matt, that was in your paper, I think. Okay. So the challenge to urban scholars and everybody in this room is, how do we put those ideas together? And how do we put those ideas together in some meaningful way? Now, I recently stumbled on a textbook which is pretty useful by Darren, and I'm not sure I pronounced his name, Asemoglu, very good textbook. And he talks about economic development and how we got so rich. He talks about organizations and the importance of organizations. And let me flip to his graphic. His graphic shows a lot of things that we know about. Institutions matter, institutions give us incentives. There's human capital, physical capital. They spout out technological knowledge, and they give us GDP per capita improvements over time. But in the middle here, he puts organization. And I think everybody knows that organization can include many things, many shells. And the organization, or the mode of organization that we're interested in, is cities. How do cities organize all this good stuff to give us good results? So he doesn't mention it in his chapter, but it's a cinch to say that, well, everybody knows, again, most economic activity, which we're going to call organization, occurs in cities. And as John pointed out, and as others point out, is that the spatial organization within cities, when we say organization happens in cities, we mean the spatial organization of cities, and that's what we look to in order to say something intelligent about how all these things hang together. So, on the way to addressing these big questions, which is what the afternoon, I guess, is about, is what do we know? And first of all, I think we know that most settlement trends are mainly in the direction away from compactness. Now, the question that immediately comes up is this a market failure? And that's, of course, the interesting question. And I think Matt addressed it and John addressed it. And we all know there are surely unpriced externalities in the world, and the textbooks call those a market failure. But of course, we also know that metering congestion emissions is cheaper than ever, but we don't do it. So you can call it a market failure, you can call it a policy failure, you can call it turtle soup, but it's not crazy to call it a policy failure. So I think we agree, John and I, that there are things that policymakers could do that would make life better. Perhaps we disagree on how they would go about doing it. Now, cities exist and succeed and contribute to economic development whenever the costs of crowding are mitigated or offset. Otherwise, there wouldn't be cities as we know. There wouldn't be any cities. And they do this because there are, here's this organization thing again, there are spatial arrangements whereby transactions costs are reduced when location patterns are the way we like them. And of course, on top of that, there are a bunch of positive externalities in the world, which again become realized if we get better as opposed to worse location patterns. So going back to the externalities question, it's not that cities disregard or ruin the externalities internalization, it's that land markets can help us in this way. So, land use patterns emerge more or less, and I agree more or less, to realize the possible economies, this kind and that kind. And what's essential there is that these involve or these promote the essential transfers of knowledge and information, which I think John alluded to. You mentioned Jane Jacobs, and she was all about that. Okay, so the key question, which is evoked by John's talk, is that and I shouldn't accuse him of this, but let's say John the straw man before I had your paper, when I was channeling you, right? Okay. Can top-down planning achieve these complex results? And of course, perhaps we agree that the record is mixed on whether top-down planning can generate the results that give us the kinds of benefits that are suggested in our urban economics knowledge. Okay, and there we get into Hayek, who's been mentioned, we get into Jane Jacobs, who's been mentioned, and I think their answer would be, if we channel them, that the answer is no, and that there is essential local knowledge which is too dispersed to be picked up by top-down planners. And so I think this is all sort of throat clearing, and it's imperfectly reasonable, I think. So, perhaps here's a natural experiment. And here we're looking at suburbanization in a lot of places: the US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong. Let's not count Hong Kong, it's about one place. Israel only has one place over 1 million. And the growth is pretty much in the suburbs, no matter what you do. In other words, there are places around the world that have policies that many people in America dream of, but it doesn't matter. It seemingly doesn't matter. So in other words, the question which the graphic poses is, do preferences trump policies? And we spend a lot of time talking about better policies or worse policies, and that's an interesting discussion, but we have a hint here that maybe it doesn't matter. Now, this is these are data prepared by Bum-Soo Lee when he was my student some years ago, and he and I are still working on this stuff. And Bum-Soo, in his papers and dissertation, we have a couple of joint papers coming out, did a lot of work on using the census data to identify where all these centers and sub-centers are. And so he took the year 2000 employment, and he located people, workers, by whether they are in the traditional downtown, in the sub-centers, or everywhere else. And he did it for 70 plus places. Here are the summary results for the 3 million plus places. Here they are, and then summary results for the 1 to 3 million and 500,000. But it doesn't matter a whole lot. First of all, most of the jobs are not in centers and not in downtowns. That's the way the world is. And then, if we look at these same folks and look at their commutes, and this is data for 2000, and these are for the drive-alone people only. So it's not polluted by mode differences from place to place. So it looks like the people working in dispersed places have the best commutes, I think across the board. I think the people working in the centers have a less good commute. I guess the worst commute is people that work in downtown or in the New York CBDs. Maybe the best commute on this chart is the people that are dispersed all over the place in Phoenix. So that's the sprawl stuff, and it has some positive attributes associated. Same data, and we have a paper coming out on this. We have a paper coming out on this which adds the multivariate controls to the bivariate stuff that you're looking at. So here we have metro area size and how commuting times respond to size. But now we're looking at people within those areas, whether they work in the downtown, whether they work in sub-centers, or whether they work everywhere else. So here's your steepest curve, here's your least steep curve, and of course what we are attaching to this result is that these big places survive and continue to do their function by dispersing. And some people call it sprawl. Sprawl is a funny word, means many things to many people, but it is essentially auto-oriented development. I don't know what sprawl is. I know what auto-oriented development is. I know that around the world, as people earn more, they want to buy a car. And as auto ownership goes up, origins and destinations disperse. And as origins and destinations disperse, people have a greater demand for an automobile, and you know the rest of the story. Okay, so when people talk about density and compactness, I find that too general and too vague to be useful. There's a large literature in urban economics where people fudge, I believe, because they rely on metro area-wide or county-wide average densities, and that masks and obscures a lot of important variation, because as John and others have pointed out, there's tremendous variability within these large areas. So there's a lot of urban economics that relies on this crude measure, which doesn't really help us. So just to race through my remarks, so what we did, and this is in research that is forthcoming, we looked at these smaller areas, and the smallest areas that we could get good data for are the PUMS areas, which we call PUMAs. That's a nice word, right? And we had 2005 data. We looked at arrivals by people in the MA plus category, master's degree or above. So that's our human capital measure. We ranked the top 25 MA plus receiving PUMAs in America. 1,750 of them are metro. We looked at the top 25, and guess what? A lot of these very, very smart human capital creative people go to high density areas, and a lot of them go to low density areas. Surprise, surprise. Density is not a great predictor. For the top 25 PUMAs, I think, let's see, 4 were in Manhattan, 4 were in Silicon Valley, that's nice. A bunch were in other places. The density and the size contrast between the top beneficiaries or the top receiving places were huge. So it's no secret that there's a whole lot more complexity than to say density is it. Now, people talk about livable communities. That's another jargon. I'm not always sure what they mean. There is talk now of livable communities becoming a federal responsibility or a federal priority. I know that the Secretary of Transportation at the recent TRB meetings tried to define that. Means you could go all day without a car, and for some people that's good. I'm told that I'm not told, I've seen that draft of the 2009 Surface Transportation Reauthorization put a lot of money into public transit in pursuit of this idea, and here are some data. So here is where transit utilization has been going in America, and here's where, this is subsidies, and this is boardings, and we're not supposed to infer cause and effect from correlations, but in a weak moment I would say the more money we push at these things, the worse they get. So, in my rushing through my comments, I think without necessarily disagreeing with a lot of things that John said, there's pretty strong evidence for the power of preferences over policies. And, you know, is that good news or bad news? Well, policymakers can do good things, they can do bad things. So maybe if they're inept, or maybe if they are impotent, it's not so bad. So I took this graphic off the textbook of a pretty good macroeconomics textbook that's recently come out. Should put a date on here. So here you have 130 years of per capita GDP growth in America, real per capita GDP growth in America, and it sticks to a fairly narrow band. And no matter who's in office or who's making policy, and I put this in the good news column. So, where do these observations leave us? Well, continued innovation, growth, and prosperity are going to depend on cities fulfilling what I'm calling the congenial host to entrepreneurial success function. And I worked on this acronym all morning, but I couldn't say that. Okay, so maybe it'll stick, maybe it won't. Okay. And what does this mean? I mean, everything I've said so far means that this involves very complex spatial arrangements. And again, there's the interesting debate on whether those complex spatial arrangements can be invented by smart people like us, or whether we should stand back and let the market do its thing. So this is a vote for flexible land markets and respecting the emerging spatial orders that come about, because maybe emerging spatial orders and letting them happen is the best we can do. And listening to John, I think he was trembling on the brink of being close to that observation. Maybe I'm misrepresenting you and channeling you that way. Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me respond to that briefly. I think that the observations about the smart growth movement or the new urbanist movement often focus on, for conservatives, and I don't mean to label, I'm not trying to pick on you, but just generally, conservatives tend to look at the movement as being something that's trying to impose an order on society that the society doesn't want to follow. And I've tried to keep CNU off of that path as much as possible, and instead on looking at the metrics and the regulations themselves. I mean, that's what we spend a lot of time trying to break through on, for example, connectivity. The Charlotte Fire Department in the city of Charlotte did a study that showed that if neighborhoods are well connected instead of cul-de-sacs, they can serve 20,000 households with a fire station instead of 5,000 households. Now that saves money. You don't need quite as many firefighters, you don't need quite as many trucks, and you don't need as many stations. And so if you look at it at that practical level, urban connectivity is a good thing. If you look at pedestrian accidents, the big roads, fatalities happen, the smaller roads, they don't happen. And those are things that lead to conclusions that don't depend on having an obsessive love affair with regional planning commissions and MPOs and all that. When I was in the legislature before I was mayor, and I sponsored an amendment in a budget that went through one house but didn't get through the other would have eliminated all funding for the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, because I thought they were trying to screw Milwaukee every chance they got. And I didn't like it. And they were not subject to control of the elected government. So, I mean, maybe the smart growth movement, which sometimes I argue with, the best definition of smart growth I've ever heard is, well, you know what I mean. And that's a problem that they have, because it's not always defined. But we need to focus on metrics, and there's a lot of stuff underneath this big fight. I mean, I think there's no serious possibility whatsoever of having a land use regulation like Hamburg, Germany has in the United States. I mean, with our property laws. I was an amicus curiae on the Kalo versus New London case on the side of the plaintiffs. I mean, I'm not against property rights, and CNU isn't. We're for school choice vouchers. We're for all kinds. We're for whatever works. But I think that the city, for a lot of reasons, the city has a lot of value. And cities that have healthy cores tend to also have healthy suburbs and healthy exurbs. Detroit being an example of one that has unhealthy in all cases. So we should continue our discussion about this sometime, because I think there's a lot of argument going on about things that really aren't the central points, I think, at least for some of us.
There's some questions for Don. Can you take a few questions?
Sure.
Michael?
So I think this discussion has raised something that's actually been at the core of debates in urban economics recently, which is, does the low density sprawl that we have here in the States, is it reflecting essentially, some kind of spontaneous emerging, preference set of Americans to live in those kind of environments, and that, there's a whole sequence of conclusions you draw if that's the case? Or is it, I think your argument, if I'm reinterpreting, is that it was kind of a rigged game, that a bunch of policies conspired to create low density, and that therefore we can't read from what happened backward and say, what we got was an expression of revealed preference.
Well, I wouldn't even go, I don't think I would go as far as to say that sprawl is just created by the government interference. I just think the government interferes more in favor of decentralization than it does I mean, the street, the avenue, the boulevard, those are not things that the federal government or the state DOTs have in their normal playbook. You can do them. There's a federal flexibility manual that'll let you do just about anything, but it's an exception. So that the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac programs support sprawl development. And it's not, I don't like the sprawl word either. It's very confusing. I think you can have low density development that's coherent. You can have urban centers and villages, and people can live in relatively low density environments that are much more urban, in the sense that you can have a community with various activities in it, and spreading, like that guy from University of Illinois, Chicago, wrote this book about, saying that the people are spreading out over the landscape. Big deal. Yeah, okay, so what?
There's an issue that arises.
Why is that? That doesn't mean that urbanism is bad because people spread out over the landscape. And when the public policies confound any ability to create urbanism anew, and now that's changing. I'm extremely optimistic. Tyson's Corners is being reconfigured. They saw what happened with Bethesda, and they want to do the same thing in Tyson's Corners. That's great.
But we as researchers, I think, what the discussion of both of you is sort of making me think is that we, in an ideal world, I would like to know how much of what part of our the density patterns we've gotten is from what people really wanted versus policies that did it, and how much of it was endogenous to the policies, so that people learned a set of choices that don't do or don't express their preferences. That would be the dream as a researcher.
Sure. The reason I had that slide up about international suburbanization is because it prompts me to say that radical or drastic or substantial policy differences don't seem to make a difference. I think that's the important question. I think that there are wonderful lessons to be made from international comparisons. When we look at international comparisons at a certain level, we see suburbanization almost across the board. That tells us something. I think that in Western Europe, there are policies that American planners dream of, many of them. But I was in Paris last year, and I promise you, people are moving to the suburbs. You've been to other places in Europe. And when you look at the Parisian suburbs, you think you're in America. And they don't have our policies. And I think that's an important point.
Sure.
I have to take a little bit of an issue with Peter, your last point about this international evidence. It's not that the policy has not changed, the policy has changed. And that in fact, the reason they're sprawling is because they've compromised on the original policy. A very good case in point is the Ruhr area, which we did some studies on. The Ruhr had a regional open space plan system which was designed to contain the growth within the, how many different cities are in the Ruhr area. But over the years, basically those green spaces have become the right-of-way for the freeways. And at the same time, their control for the development has actually disappeared. So the Germans are, now you might say, well, that's preference, but yeah, perhaps, but don't say that the policy hasn't changed. The policy has sort of been significantly compromised. So, so it's not quite that kind of a causal relationship that, regardless of policies, that preferences are changing or showing a similar pattern everywhere.
Chris?
Well, two things. One is, this morning we were talking about whether there were these warning signs about big change, right? Shift. I think the first sign of the apocalypse just happened with Peter and John getting along so well. I was just about to do this. But I think the thing I've learned a lot in the last couple of years is these small municipal ordinances that seem to be pervasive in urban infill. So between land accumulation, parking requirements, if you guys listen to Mott Smith talking about parking, it's this extraordinary impact on the urban form because if you have setbacks, you have this, Pasadena succeeded because they managed the parking problem. So there's this, I think cataloging these sort of small innocuous things that no one thinks are important. No one wants to talk about parking or studying parking, but if you require on-site parking, you have to cut a building in half, make more open space, then the building doesn't work, the small lot doesn't work anymore, that whole area doesn't work. So
our feeling on off-street parking is that it should be between the property owner and the tenants of the property owner. That, if that, that's not something that I think is the image of people that care about.
But we talk about regulation this morning. We have these indexes of regulation, and then you talk to developers about regulation. They got really specific things that get in their way. The setbacks, the parking requirements. These really small things. And I think that maybe the burden is on us to actually take some of the real world stuff and bring it in. Mott's got me convinced that parking solutions are, a central part of urban renewal problem. And all these other things we talk about are important, but these sort of small stuff that I think you bring up are, really relevant. Yeah.
Well, I think, it's important to make a distinction between direction and magnitude. What Peter's result tells me is the direction is clear, that there's decentralization, and that's not surprising. We've learned today that as people get richer and they urbanize, they have fewer children. So households are just smaller, and so as a result of that, you're just going to have fewer people in the same amount of space. And of course, as we get richer, we want more things, and one of those things is land. And so as we have more stuff, one of the things we're going to have is bigger houses on bigger lots. And I think those are pretty benign things. And so you're seeing that in Western Europe, in Japan, in the US. But that's different from the pace at which it's happening. And I do worry about, I think John, he hit on Fannie and Freddie, but more important was when the FHA was put into place, in the post-war, well, it was put in place before World War II, but when it really got going in the post-war era, it absolutely discriminated against central cities in favor of suburbs. I mean, you just have to read through the rules for getting an FHA loan and the way appraisals were done, and it directed a flow of capital to suburbs that was forbidden to go to a place like the Lower East Side of New York City. So I think I think you can agree with Peter, and I do, that cities are going to spread out because of preferences and because we're getting richer and because we're having fewer children, and I think that's all benign. I think that's all fine. But to the extent that there are government distortions that accelerate that process, I think that is a policy problem, and I think what John is arguing is these distortions have had a lot to do with the pace at which we've seen what we've seen in the last.
For example, I don't think that
See, I'm trying to make everybody.
I don't think the American electorate made a considered decision to have the functional classification level of service system for roads. You know, if you did a visual preference survey, do you want Main Street with the elm trees and the little corner drugstore and all that, they'd pick it every time. I mean, one of the things that whenever I get in a debate, like with a Wendell Cox or something, is all my slides are pictures and all his slides are words, except for he now has these slides of the edges of Paris, you know, showing the truck terminals and the used car dealerships and all that, which they have. I mean, they do. But even in those kinds of environments, you can offer alternatives that create urbanism. And we have there's a guy named Tom Lowe who's in Charlotte, an architect in Charlotte, who started something called low imprint urbanism, light imprint urbanism, as an alternative to low impact urbanism, which is what McDonald's and Starbucks and everybody, you ever notice how the Starbucks stores, which have such a cultural quality to them that's attractive in the cities, when you get out in the suburbs, they have these big drainage ditches and giant parking lots. That's because they're doing the wrong landscape architecture. They could do low density stores that are as beautiful as the ones they have in the city, but they're doing the wrong stuff. It's dumbed down. It's based on specialization like drainage instead of looking at how to create a good place. And you know, that's the level where I think we can have have the greatest impact on public policy now, is to get into these rules. And Peter, if I were you, I would be worried about the sustainability programs that are coming out of EPA HUD and DOT and the partnership. You know, I agree, I know and like and agree with a lot of those people, but I think there's a self-confidence and a hubris that's in that group right now that really needs detailed criticism. And I mean, what happens when they lose an election, and then the Heritage Foundation goes in and does the same thing in reverse? And I've tried to caution some of my colleagues about that.
Not necessarily in reverse.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me that, you know, the two of you do have a lot of points of agreement, and the place where you're sort of talking past each other is in part an issue of measurement, right? So Peter's argument is, well, look, there are, you know, highly educated people going to high density places and low density places, you know, and John puts up this slide and shows you can do, you know, walkable, urban feeling communities at variety of densities. And part of the problem is that density is a really crude measure of good neighborhoods, or, you know, in cities or suburbs or anything else. And so, you know, it could be that highly educated people are going to low density and high density places measured by number of units per acre, people per acre, but then in a lot of ways they look aesthetically similar, right? And part of the problem is that we don't have measures, we don't have data, or we don't have sort of conceptual measures of getting at the kinds of neighborhoods that you're showing us in pictures. And so I'm wondering whether, you know, the architects or the landscape architects or geographers can help us figure out ways to, you know, capture this somehow in a way that we can then compare things without just using density.
Well, we're throwing metrics out there and expect to, you know, fall on our face and make fools out of ourselves on some of them. Like right now in Lead ND, we've got, for a TOD station that should be 90 intersections per square mile minimum, which is not really that many intersections, minimum near suburban transit station. And, you know, we just throw those things out there. It's arbitrary. That could be the wrong number. Hopefully if somebody thinks there's a different number, they'll argue it. But that's what we did with the school facilities. For years, we said how stupid it was to have 30-acre requirement for high school. And the states were codifying that, like North Carolina, Alabama, all these states requiring 30 acres. And so instead of just bitching about it, we put out an alternative. And we'll see if it gets picked up. And, you know, we'd really like to battle over these things at that level instead of a culture war, you know, the Roundheads versus the Cavaliers.
All right, thank you very much.